The letter arrived on a damp Tuesday morning, its envelope thick with the kind of handwriting that suggested someone had labored over every curve and flourish, as if each stroke carried a secret weight. Miss Marple, seated at her breakfast table in the quiet of her St. Mary Mead cottage, regarded it with a flicker of surprise. Invitations were rare these days, especially to weddings. Most of the children of her acquaintances had long since tied their knots, and few bothered to include an elderly lady like her on their guest lists. Yet here it was, the paper crisp and slightly damp from the morning mist, its edges trimmed with an elegance that felt almost too deliberate. She reached for her letter opener, the silver handle cool against her fingers, and sliced through the seal with a precision that belied her years. The invitation inside was from Mildred Henderson, a name that tugged at the edges of her memory. Competent, chatty, inclined toward embroidery rather than gossip, which was unusual for a woman of her age. Miss Marple remembered her from a church committee years ago, a fleeting association that had faded like old lace. Now, Mildred was summoning her to Hawthorne Grange, a stately house not far from St. Mary Mead, for the wedding of her niece, Lavinia. The phrasing struck her immediately. The family would be delighted to have you. Delighted? The word hung there, faintly strained, as if Mildred had chosen it carefully to mask something else. Why her? Miss Marple's sharp mind, honed by decades of untangling village secrets, latched onto the question. Her connection to the bride was tenuous at best, a thread so thin it might snap under scrutiny. Yet the invitation was insistent, almost urgent, as if her presence were suddenly indispensable. She tucked the card beside her teacup, the china clinking softly as she lifted it to her lips. The steam rose, fragrant and familiar, but her thoughts were already racing. Curiosity, that old companion, had been thoroughly piqued. The drive to Hawthorne Grange the following day took her past fields dappled with early spring light, the grass still wet from recent rains, and narrow lanes edged with hedgerows in desperate need of trimming. The house itself emerged at the end of a gravel path, its ivy-clad facade grand but weary, speaking more of faded inheritance than present wealth. The crunch of tires on gravel seemed to echo in the stillness, and as Miss Marple stepped out, adjusting her coat against a sudden chill, she felt the first prickle of unease at the door. A young maid answered, her nervous hand smoothing the apron over her skirt in a gesture that was more defensive than welcoming. "Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, as if the name itself carried a weight she wasn't prepared for. Without waiting for confirmation, she ushered Miss Marple into the front hall, her footsteps quick and uneven on the polished floor. The atmosphere struck Miss Marple at once. Not the bustle of happy preparations, but a hush, a tension that hung like damp curtains, as if the house itself were treading carefully around its own secrets. The portrait of a stern-faced woman dominated the mantelpiece, her gaze fixed sharply upon the room, judging every guest who entered. Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing as she took in the painted features, cold, unyielding, as if the woman were still present, still watching. Moments later, Mildred appeared, all flutter and welcome, her smile wide but flickering whenever the word wedding slipped into conversation. "Oh, Miss Marple, how wonderful you could come," she exclaimed, her voice too bright, too forced, as if she were performing a role she hadn't fully rehearsed. Introductions followed, each one laced with a peculiar edge. The bride, Lavinia, was lovely but pale, her smile a shade too bright, her eyes darting toward the staircase as if expecting, or dreading, someone's arrival. Her brother, Julian, hovered near the drinks table, his brooding air punctuated by a politeness that felt rehearsed, his fingers tightening around a glass, as if it were a lifeline. Then there was the cousin. Miss Marple immediately forgot her name, but her resentful stare, sharp and lingering, was impossible to ignore. It was all very charming on the surface, but beneath that polished veneer, Miss Marple could feel a story beginning to stir, its edges dark and jagged. Tea was served in the morning room, the china delicate, the conversation brittle. Miss Marple settled comfortably between Mildred and the vicar's wife, saying very little, but listening intently. Conversations in houses like this had a particular texture, one she had come to know well over years of village mysteries. Not the easy chatter of celebration, but the guarded exchanges of people with something to hide. The bride's mother, Ella was conspicuously absent, her absence explained away with murmurs of a headache. But the glance exchanged between Mildred and the housekeeper, a woman with watchful eyes and thin lips, suggested the headache had little to do with nerves and far more with memory. That it took only a gentle nudge for the vicar's wife, who had a fondness for scandal, to lean closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The mother's dress," she said, the words heavy with implication, as if they carried the weight of a buried secret. The very same one her sister was meant to wear before it all happened. Miss Marple didn't ask directly. Scandals, especially those buried beneath decades of family silence, preferred to emerge sideways, like smoke seeping from beneath a closed door. But the seed was planted, and as Mildred spoke loudly of cakes and flowers, Miss Marple's attention fixed on the silences, the pauses where the real story began to take shape. The afternoon drifted on, and Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the tension in the room. Lavinia fluttered between guests, her eyes darting toward the staircase whenever her mother's absence was noted, her laughter too quick, too brittle. Julian spoke to no one unless spoken to, his smile unfailingly polite, but always a second too slow, as if he were calculating each word. The housekeeper, a sentry more than a servant, kept to the edges of every room, her posture rigid, her gaze sharp. And Mildred, dear, well-meaning Mildred, filled every silence with reassurances so overeager they only confirmed that something was very wrong. Miss Marple knew houses like this. Weddings and funerals often walked hand in hand here, long-held resentments and buried scandals rising to the surface at precisely the wrong moment. But what troubled her most was the way everyone avoided mentioning the dress Lavinia would wear, the dress with its own unhappy history. It was as if the mere mention of it might shatter the fragile pretense of normalcy, and in that avoidance, Miss Marple sensed the first clue of a puzzle far larger than a simple wedding celebration. The last crumbs of seed cake disappeared, and the clock chimed 4. Miss Marple knew without question that this was no ordinary event. The house was a stage, and its occupants were players, each hiding something behind their polite smiles and careful words. If no one else intended to uncover why, well, she would. Her curiosity, sharp as ever, demanded it. And as she watched the maid clear the tea things, her hands trembling slightly as she stacked the delicate cups, Miss Marple filed away another detail. Fear, like a shadow, was already creeping into every corner of Hawthorne Grange. The morning after her arrival at Hawthorne Grange dawned with a heaviness that seemed to press against the windows, a gray light seeping through curtains that hadn't been drawn properly, leaving jagged shadows on the walls. Miss Marple rose early, her movements deliberate, the faint click of her teacup against its saucer a small defiance against the oppressive silence that filled the house. The air felt thick, charged with a tension that wasn't quite silence but a restless hum, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to break. She descended the staircase, her hand brushing the banister, where she noticed faint scuff marks, deep, irregular scratches, as if someone had clawed at the wood in desperation or rage. The marks were fresh, the wood still pale where the varnish had been torn away, and no one else seemed to see them, their eyes fixed on their own private anxieties. In the kitchen, the maid who had greeted her the previous day was already at work, her hands shaking as she polished a silver tray that gleamed too brightly, as if she were trying to erase something more than tarnish. "Morning, miss," she mumbled, her voice a brittle whisper, her eyes darting away, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze as if it might burn. There was no warmth, no curiosity, just a hurried, almost fearful dismissal, as if the girl feared lingering too long in her presence. By mid-morning, the household stirred, but it was a sluggish, reluctant awakening, devoid of the excitement one might expect before a wedding. Lavinia, the bride, appeared in the drawing room, her face paler than yesterday, her eyes sunken as if she hadn't slept, or worse, had seen something that haunted her dreams. She clutched a bouquet of wilting flowers, their petals browning at the edges, her fingers tightening around the stems until tiny thorns pierced her skin, drawing beads of blood that she ignored, letting them drip onto the carpet in silent, unnoticed streaks. "It's almost time," she said, her voice pitched too high, too bright, a brittle facade that cracked at the edges, as if she were trying to convince herself more than anyone else. No one responded. The room was a tableau of indifference. Julian, her brother, stood by the window, staring out at the fog-shrouded garden, his glass of whiskey untouched, but gripped so tightly his knuckles whitened, the amber liquid trembling slightly with each breath. His jaw was set, his eyes distant, as if he were miles away, or perhaps trapped in a memory he couldn't escape. The cousin, whose name Miss Marple still couldn't recall, though her bitterness was unforgettable, paced the hall, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm against the floorboards, muttering under her breath about debts and what's owed. Her voice a low, resentful drone that no one acknowledged, as if her words were just another piece of furniture in the room, ignored but present. Her fingers tugged at a loose thread on her sleeve, unraveling it further until it dangled, forgotten, a small act of destruction amid the larger chaos. Mildred, ever the host, flitted between rooms like a moth drawn to a flame she couldn't name, her smile fixed and brittle, her eyes darting nervously toward the staircase, as if expecting, or dreading, someone's arrival. Once, Miss Marple saw her pause by a mirror, her hand reaching out to touch her reflection, only to pull back as if startled by her own image, a flicker of fear crossing her face before it was masked again. The housekeeper, a gaunt woman with lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, moved silently through the house, her shadow stretching long and distorted across the walls as she adjusted curtains that didn't need adjusting and dusted shelves already spotless, her movements mechanical but edged with a vigilance that suggested she was guarding something or someone. Miss Marple noticed her pause by the fireplace, her hand brushing against a loose brick in the mantel, testing its solidity with a fingertip before moving on, her breath catching in a sound so soft it might have been imagined. No one else saw, their attention consumed by their own fears, but Miss Marple filed it away, a detail too small to mean anything yet, but too deliberate to ignore that it was just after dawn, though, when the first crack appeared in the house's fragile facade, a moment that would unravel the pretense of normalcy and plunge them all into chaos. The maid, tasked with fetching the bridal gown from the wardrobe, re-entered the morning room later, her face drained of color, her hands shaking so violently the fabric she carried seemed to tremble with her. The dress, once pure white silk, now marred by an ugly, rust-colored stain across the bodice, lay draped over her arms like a corpse, its folds heavy with dread. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that sucks the air from a space, leaving only the sound of ragged breathing and the faint tick of a clock that seemed suddenly too loud. Mildred was the first to react, her teacup rattling against its saucer, spilling a thin stream of liquid onto the tablecloth in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, like a map of some forgotten tragedy. "Oh no," she gasped, her voice a mix of horror and disbelief. But there was no conviction in it, no real surprise, just a rehearsed shock, as if she'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it, yet half expecting it all along. Her eyes flicked to Lavinia, then away, as if afraid to linger. Julian stared, his eyes wide but unseeing, his glass slipping from his hand to thud softly on the carpet, the whiskey seeping into the fibers like blood. Lavinia arrived moments later, her hands flying to her mouth, a sharp, brittle sound escaping her lips before she could stop it, a sound that was part scream, part sob, and wholly desperate. "Who did this?" she demanded, her voice rising, sharp enough to cut through the thick air, but no one answered. No one could. The stain was deliberate, Miss Marple noted, positioned right over the heart of the dress, dried and unmistakable, like a wound that refused to heal, its edges jagged, its color a deep, ominous rust that seemed to pulse in the dim light. The room filled with accusations wrapped in politeness, a dance of words meant to mask panic but only amplifying it. Someone suggested it was a cruel prank, a childish attempt at drama, their voice trembling as if they didn't believe it themselves. Another muttered about the curse, a word that hung in the air like a bad smell, heavy and suffocating, while the cousin snapped, "Old grudges, that's what this is," her voice cracking with a venom that suggested she knew more than she let on. Her fingers, still tugging at that loose thread, now tore it completely, the fabric of her sleeve fraying further, A small act of destruction amid the larger chaos that no one else noticed. Miss Marple, her knitting in her lap, said nothing. She watched hands twist, eyes flick sideways, and voices strained to sound casual when they were anything but. It wasn't the prank itself that interested her, if it even was a prank, but the way each person reacted, their indifference masking a deeper fear, their fear masking guilt. Julian stood slightly apart, arms crossed, his gaze not on his sister but on the housekeeper, who, in turn, glanced repeatedly at the sideboard drawer, her hand hovering near it as if tempted to open it, only to pull back each time, her breath catching in a sound so soft it might have been imagined. The cousin's protests were too loud, too insistent, her voice cracking as she claimed it must be a coincidence, a freak accident. But her fingers betrayed her, unraveling the thread until it dangled, forgotten, on the floor, a small, overlooked detail that spoke volumes. Lavinia wept openly, her sobs punctuated by pauses, as if listening for something more than comfort. A sound, a step, a whisper from the shadows. Her eyes darted to the ceiling, then to the door, as if expecting someone to burst in with answers or accusations. Miss Marple noticed a small scratch on Lavinia's wrist, fresh and red, as if she'd caught it on something sharp, but no one else saw, their attention fixed on the dress. The housekeeper, still silent, moved to the window, her fingers tracing the edge of a curtain, where a single thread hung loose, snagged and dangling, as if someone had torn it in haste. No one else noticed, but Miss Marple did, her mind cataloging each anomaly, each whisper of disorder in a house that prided itself on order. By midday, the house had fractured into uneasy factions, each group retreating to its corner like wounded animals, their indifference a shield against the terror they couldn't name. The bride's former suitor, a man with a perpetual sneer and a fondness for drink, hovered near the window, his eyes darting toward Lavinia whenever her back was turned, his fingers tracing the edge of a chipped glass, as if searching for courage or an excuse. Julian watched him like a cat watches a mouse, his posture protective but tense, his words to Lavinia too gentle, too rehearsed, as if trying to erase some past harshness that lingered like a bad taste. Once, Miss Marple saw him pause by the mantel, his hand brushing against the portrait of the stern-faced woman, his fingers lingering on the frame as if seeking guidance or forgiveness. The cousin paced, her mutterings about inheritances growing louder, more personal, her bitterness no longer veiled but raw, like an exposed nerve. Her shadow, cast by a flickering candle, danced on the wall, distorted and grotesque, and Miss Marple noticed a small, blackened mark on the floor beneath it, as if the candle had dripped wax in a hurry, then been snuffed out. No one else saw, their attention consumed by the stained dress, now folded and hidden away in a cupboard that smelled faintly of mildew and regret. The housekeeper, still silent and tight-lipped, went about her work with a stiffness that suggested she knew more than she intended to reveal. Once, Miss Marple caught her pausing by the fireplace again, her hand pressing against that same loose brick, this time with a force that made it shift slightly, a faint grating sound echoing in the silence before she stepped back, her face paling. Later, during one of her quiet wanders through the house, Miss Marple found herself in a small sitting room near the back staircase, a room that smelled of dust and disuse, its furniture draped in shadows. A glass display case stood slightly ajar, its velvet lining revealing the usual heirlooms, silver spoons, a locket, and a pair of cufflinks. But there was a gap, a void where something had been removed, the shape suggesting a knife, small, ceremonial, the kind families once used to cut wedding cakes in grander days. The velvet was indented, the fabric slightly frayed, as if the object had been yanked out in haste, leaving behind a faint smear of something dark, oil, blood. No one had mentioned a missing knife, no one seemed to have noticed, but Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of the case, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. She noticed other things, too, things no one else saw. A candle on the dining room table, its wax melted unevenly, as if someone had snuffed it out in a hurry, the wick still smoking faintly, a thin trail of gray curling upward like a question mark. A scrap of lace caught in the hinge of a door, white and delicate, torn at the edge as if ripped away in panic, its threads tangled with a single strand of dark hair, too short to belong to Lavinia. A faint scratch on the floorboards near the staircase, fresh and deep, as if something heavy had been dragged or dropped in the dead of night. The wood splintered and pale where the varnish had been torn away. Each detail was a whisper, a clue buried beneath the chaos, and Miss Marple collected them like pebbles, knowing their weight would grow with time. By evening, the household had drifted into a strange, oppressive silence, each occupant retreating to their private fears, their private theories, their indifference a shield against the terror they couldn't name. Miss Marple sat once more with her knitting, offering her usual gentle smile to anyone who glanced her way, a smile carefully neutral, designed to reassure without revealing. But behind that smile, her thoughts moved swiftly, tracing the shape of what had begun long before this wedding day. The dress, the stain, the missing knife, they weren't isolated incidents but echoes, ripples from a single terrible event, a prelude to something darker still. She noticed a crack in the plaster above the mantel, small but fresh, as if someone had struck it in anger or fear. The white dust still settled on the floor beneath. A clock in the hall ticked unevenly, its second hand jerking forward, then pausing, as if unsure whether to continue. A vase on the sideboard, filled with flowers that should have been fresh, was wilting, their petals brown and curling, a single petal lying on the floor, trampled and ignored. Each anomaly was a thread, and Miss Marple was weaving them together, her mind a labyrinth of questions. Whose blood was on the dress? Why had no one asked that question aloud? And what connection did it have to the past, to the stern-faced woman in the portrait, whose eyes seemed to follow her even now, their painted gaze a silent accusation? The night deepened, and the house settled into a restless quiet, broken only by the occasional creak of aging floorboards, the distant chime of a clock, and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of someone, or something, moving in the shadows. Miss Marple remained vigilant, her mind racing, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythm that steadied her as the mystery thickened, its edges blurred, its center obscured by fear and indifference. The house was a puzzle, its pieces scattered, and she knew that unraveling it would require more than just observation. It would demand patience and, perhaps, a willingness to confront the unthinkable, the unspeakable, the truths that lurked in the corners no one dared to look. The day after the discovery of the bloodstained dress, Hawthorne Grange seemed to shrink into itself, its grand facade crumbling under the weight of unspoken fears and fractured trust. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, the faint creak of her bedroom door echoing in the stillness, a sound so soft it might have been swallowed by the house's deeper, darker whispers. She noticed a single cobweb in the corner of her room, its threads trembling in a draft no one else would feel, and a smudge of dirt on the windowsill, as if someone had pressed their fingers there in haste, leaving behind a faint, oily residue. These details, small and seemingly insignificant, were like breadcrumbs in a forest of secrets, but she knew better than to assume they pointed to the truth. Downstairs, the breakfast room was a tableau of tension, the silverware gleaming too brightly, the china rattling slightly as hands trembled. Lavinia sat at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of a napkin, the fabric fraying under her nervous touch, a tiny tear forming where her nail caught. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale as the milk in her untouched tea, and she murmured something about the weather, her voice a fragile thread that snapped when Julian entered, his face set in a mask of indifference that didn't quite hide the flicker of panic in his eyes. He poured himself coffee, the cup clinking against the saucer, a sound sharp enough to make the housekeeper, still silent and watchful, flinch at the sink. Mildred bustled in, her smile too wide, too forced, her hands adjusting a vase of flowers that needed no adjustment, the petals already browning at the edges, one falling to the tablecloth in slow motion, unnoticed by all but Miss Marple. The cousin, whose name remained elusive, paced near the window, her shadow cast long and jagged by the morning light, her muttering now a low, incessant drone about justice and debts unpaid, her fingers still tugging at that same loose thread on her sleeve, now so frayed it threatened to unravel entirely. No one responded, their indifference a shield, their fear a shadow that darkened every corner. The ceremony took place that afternoon in the small stone chapel on the estate grounds, a place where sunlight should have filtered prettily through stained glass, catching the bride's veil in a gentle shimmer. But no one noticed the light. All eyes were on Lavinia, her hands trembling so violently she struggled to hold her bouquet, the flowers drooping, a single petal falling to the stone floor with a sound no one heard but Miss Marple. Her responses to the vicar came too soon or too late, never quite in step with the solemn rhythm of the service, her voice a whisper of dread rather than joy. The groom, handsome but rigid, stood beside her, his smile polite but tight, his teeth clenched behind it, his fingers twitching at his side, as if resisting the urge to flee. Miss Marple watched from the second row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, noticing the smallest things. A crack in the pew where someone had scratched a mark, a faint, almost imperceptible scent of lavender that didn't belong, wafting from the altar as if carried by a ghost. The kiss at the end was brief, almost dutiful, no one cheering as they left the chapel, the silence heavy, punctuated only by the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant call of a bird that sounded like a warning. The reception unfolded in the grand dining room, tables heavy with silver trays and flowers arranged with a precision that felt more nervous than celebratory. Guests drank champagne, but not too quickly, their laughter landing wrong, as if following an unwritten script they were afraid to deviate from. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting untouched, observing how conversation ebbed and flowed, how the vicar spoke of weather and garden fates, avoiding all mention of the morning's discovery, his voice trembling slightly on the word rain. Mildred fluttered from table to table, her smile a shade too bright, her voice pitched half an octave higher, her fingers adjusting a napkin that was already perfectly aligned. A small, nervous tick no one else saw. Lavinia's face was too pale, her laugh too quick, her gaze flickering toward her new husband with something that looked suspiciously like fear, her fingers twisting a ring on her finger, the gold scratched, the stone loose, as if it had been worn too often in distress. Julian stood near the mantel, glass in hand, answering questions too briefly, his eyes skimming the room but never settling, his shoe scuffing a small mark on the floor that no one else noticed, a crescent of dirt that mirrored the shape of the missing knife's hilt. The housekeeper, still a sentry, moved along the edges, her face tightening whenever anyone mentioned the bride's late father, her hand brushing against a candlestick that wobbled slightly, the wax dripping in a pattern that suggested haste. As champagne was refilled and toasts raised, Miss Marple's attention drifted to two guests near the window, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a woman in a dress just a shade too youthful, their hands brushing accidentally. Both pulling back so quickly a fork clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence. No one else seemed to notice, but Miss Marple did, filing it away alongside the way Julian poured himself a second drink before the first was finished, the glass clinking against the bottle. A faint ring of condensation left on the table that no one wiped away. It was just after the cake was cut, its layers uneven, a smear of icing on the knife that didn't belong, that Mrs. Parker, a woman known for her love of whispers, sidled up to Miss Marple. "Of course," she began, her voice low and conspiratorial, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of revelation, "there was that man last night, by the garden gate." Miss Marple's brows lifted, but she said nothing, offering only a faint hum of polite interest. Dark coat, hat pulled low, just standing there, quite sinister really, Mrs. Parker continued, her fingers twisting a handkerchief, a small tear in the fabric that mirrored the tension in her voice. "I told my husband, but he said it was probably some delivery man lost on his way." She sniffed, unconvinced, her gaze darting to the window as if expecting to see the figure again. Miss Marple thanked her gently, returning to her chair, but her mind circled the tale like a cat around cream. It wasn't the stranger that intrigued her village imaginations were fertile enough, but the timing, the way Mrs. Parker had chosen this moment to mention it, her voice trembling on the word sinister, her hand brushing against a chair leg, leaving a faint smudge of makeup that no one else saw. The day wound on, but the atmosphere never relaxed, conversations growing quieter, guests drifting into tighter circles, their eyes darting to the bloodstained dress, now conspicuously absent, hidden in a cupboard whose lock was scratched, as if forced. What troubled Miss Marple most was the absence of a question, the one that should have been asked the moment the dress was discovered. Not who had stained it, or why, but whose blood it was. That was the sort of question that could only remain unspoken when the answer was too terrible to face, and she knew, with her quiet knitting and sharper-than-needles mind, that someone in this house already knew. Their indifference a mask for a guilt so deep it stained the very air. The laughter came first, too loud, too brittle, echoing awkwardly across the drawing room as glasses were raised, toast offered, a fleeting pretense of celebration. The bridesmaid stood near the center, her fingers curled around the slender stem of a champagne flute, her smile fixed, a smile that wanted to belong but never quite did. She lifted the glass to her lips, took a delicate sip, and then staggered backward, the color draining from her face like ink seeping from damp paper. There was no scream, no dramatic collapse, only the soft clatter of the glass slipping from her fingers and the whisper of fabric as she crumpled to the floor, her shoe scuffing a mark on the carpet that no one noticed. A small crescent that mirrored the one by the mantel. For a moment, no one moved, the room holding its breath, caught between disbelief and the dreadful certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. Then came the rush of voices, the scrape of chairs, and the sound of someone sobbing quietly in the corner, a sound so soft it might have been the house itself grieving. Miss Marple, seated near the door, set down her knitting with calm precision, noticing a single thread that had snagged on her needle, red as blood, though she knew it was only wool. She slipped to the side table, retrieving the fallen champagne glass with hands steadier than anyone else's, raising it to her nose, inhaling softly. Beneath the scent of cheap celebration wine, there was something else, faint, bitter, unmistakable. Poison, she thought. Not the dramatic kind beloved in novels, but something subtler, a whisper of bitterness hidden within bubbles and sentiment. She said nothing, of course. There was no need. Panic would do its work, sending blame ricocheting around the room like a trapped bird. Her job wasn't to add to the noise but to listen through it, her eyes catching the smallest details, a scratch on the table where the glass had fallen, a smudge of lipstick on the rim that didn't match the bridesmaid's shade. A flicker of relief in Julian's eyes that he quickly masked. The doctor arrived too late, his footsteps echoing in the hall, his face grim, and the whispering began, a cousin with loose morals and a looser tongue muttering behind a handkerchief scented heavily with lavender, the dress, the cursed dress. It had been worn before, by the dead woman's mother, and that wedding ended just as badly. Miss Marple listened, her mind racing, but she knew better than to dismiss it entirely. The past wasn't finished here. It sat in parlors and hallways, waiting for its invitation back. The bride's mother, Elenina, still conspicuously absent, had not touched the champagne, a detail Miss Marple filed away, along with the certainty that this wedding was haunted not by ghosts but by the living who had created them. That evening, as shadows softened the house's edges, guests drifted home, leaving behind only the family and their private miseries. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, reflecting that small villages never forgot, their memories sharp as knives, preserved in whispers and glances. The blood-stained dress, now folded in a corner, its stain dried to a darker shade, was a relic of two tragedies, not one, its silk whispering secrets she couldn't yet unravel. She asked the housekeeper for a quiet moment with it, the woman hesitating, her fingers trembling as she unlocked the cupboard, a faint scratch on the key that no one else noticed. Unfolding the dress, Miss Marple's fingers traced the fresh stain first, then the older one, fainter, near the hem, darkened with time, its shape irregular but familiar. Blood, she knew, but from when, from whom? Tucked inside the lining, between lace and silk, she found a single folded letter, its edges yellowed, its handwriting desperate, a plea from a sister who had once stood in that dress, begging understanding for taking her sister's place. She folded it back, some secrets best left to the dead, but others demanding their due. The police arrived, polite and slightly pompous, taking statements with the air of men certain they were dealing with hysteria, not murder. Miss Marple gave her account pleasantly, noticing a smudge on the officer's notepad, a faint red mark that might have been ink or something else, and a crack in the floor where he stood, fresh and sharp. But her real attention fixed on a woman by the fire, her hands clasped too tightly, her grief precise, her smile trembling at the right moments, vanishing into blankness when she thought herself unobserved, a calculation, not sorrow. Days later, Miss Marple gathered the household in the drawing room, her voice steady, tracing the so-called curse to broken engagements and bitter choices, not fate. The dress, she explained, was a distraction. The poison in the champagne was the real crime, delivered by a hand that knew the family's fears too well. She named Julian, his jealousy and desperation to secure an inheritance that didn't exist driving him to murder the bridesmaid. His protest broke, his hands trembling, but the room fell silent, the clock ticking, a sound that seemed to mock their certainty. Yet, as Julian was taken away, Miss Marple noticed a detail no one else saw, a brooch missing from the glass case. Its sapphire and pearl glinting in her memory, gone hours before the first stain appeared. The case was scratched, the velvet indented, and there was a small mark on the floor beneath it that no one had mentioned. Was it chance or another thread in the tapestry? The house settled into uneasy silence, but Miss Marple knew some stories didn't end. They waited, their threads dangling, inviting someone patient enough to tug. And so, she left Hawthorne Grange, the train rattling through fields bright with morning mist, her mind turning over the smallest details, the cobweb, the smudge, the scratch, the brooch. Had she found the whole truth? Or was there still a secret hiding in the shadows, a ghost not of the past but of the present, smiling too hard, indifferent to the ruin they'd caused? The question lingered, unanswered, as the countryside rolled by, and Miss Marple smiled thinly, knowing that some mysteries, like some stains, never fully faded.